Is 2026 the worst year to buy a property? Because house prices have dropped, the economy's weak, rents are falling. Meanwhile, the housing supply, it's still growing, which is why every week there's another news headline saying that Kiwis' love affair with property is dead. And if you've spent hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars buying property, hoping that that's how you're going to build your wealth, you'll want to come on this journey because we're going to start by unpacking all the reasons why 2026 could be a bad year to buy a house. Then, once we know what the best and worst years really look like, then we will finally know if 2026 really is the worst year to buy a property, or maybe a hidden opportunity. Because if you get this wrong, you don't just miss out, you could lock yourself into a decade of underperforming returns. Now, after analyzing decades of housing data, investing in property, and watching how the property cycle actually works, I've realized there are four main reasons why 2026 could be a bad year to invest. First, house prices have fallen around 18% from November 2021 through to May 2023. And since then, they haven't bounced back the way a lot of commentators expected. I mean, back in 2024, me and a lot of the banks and their economists, they thought that both house prices and the economy would bounce back in 2025. But it didn't happen. And if you're someone who bought a house at the peak of the market for $1 million back in 2021, the honest truth is it could be worth just $858,000 today, losing you $142,000. Which is why if you've been sitting on the sidelines, not investing in property, not buying property, you might be thinking, thank God I didn't buy back then, but also, I don't see the recovery yet. Why would I jump in now? On top of that, the economy is weak too. GDP per person, the size of the economy per person, is down nearly 2%, meaning that on average, Kiwis are getting poorer. This recession that we've just been through, it's been longer and deeper than the global financial crisis in 2008. Meanwhile, Kiwis are moving overseas in huge numbers. More people are leaving the country, especially to Australia, than ever before. And while it's true, we've got enough people moving here to New Zealand that the population's not going down, but just the other week, I was out for dinner with a friend who said, Ed, I'm looking to move to Malaysia because it just feels like it's hard to get ahead over here in New Zealand. And then there's the rental market. It's weak. Rents are going down. Landlords are saying that it's harder to find good tenants. I mean, in November, there were more rental listings than at any time over the last 10 years. If you put it all together, it's not crazy to ask, is 2026 actually the worst year to buy a property? And if I do invest or buy a house, am I walking into a dead market? Because if that's all you looked at, honestly, you'd probably walk away from property entirely. And just before we answer that question, if you're enjoying this video, do me a quick favor and hit the like button, because that's how I know which videos I should do more or less of. And honestly, it really helps with the YouTube algorithm. Subscribing, that helps too. That way you're going to get more videos like this. And if you do already subscribe, you'll know that like all investments, property doesn't move in a straight line, increasing in value all the time. No, it moves instead in cycles. You see, over the long term, yes, house prices, property prices, they tend to rise. But in the short term, they go up and down. And people often like to visualize this as the property clock. So from 6 o'clock to 12 o'clock, property prices are rising. From the top of the clock, 12 o'clock to 6 o'clock, they're falling. But where it gets interesting is there are signs that tell you what time it is on the clock. Now, most people only understand the property cycle in hindsight, but investors, they try to recognize what's going on while it's still happening. Think about the last time you heard someone say, property prices only ever goes up. Well, what part of the cycle would someone say that at? Well, it's probably going to be the boom phase of the cycle, kind of 9 o'clock to 12 o'clock, because that's when prices have started to increase. There's a shortage of tradespeople. Everyone wants to be a property developer. And honestly, it feels like property prices only go one way, even though that's not true. But then what happens between 12 to, say, 3 o'clock? Well, interest rates start to rise. The number of properties listed for sale online, that starts to build up. That causes property prices to fall. That takes us to 3 to 6 o'clock. Well, what's happening there? Well, it's the bottom of the market where prices, they could be flat for a few years. Buyers' confidence, it's pretty shot. No one believes in property anymore. There are way more sellers than buyers. But then eventually we get to 6 to 9 o'clock. And what's happening there? Well, it's the recovery phase where interest rates start to come down. Properties start to rent faster. That build-up of property listings that we had previously, that starts to get cleared out and property prices start recovering. But you might be asking, is this property clock just a theory that kind of sounds good? Or does this actually work in practice? Well, this study from the IMF looked at 40 years of house price data across 19 OECD countries and found that this property cycle, it keeps happening again and again and again, which raises the big question. If that's how the property clock works, where does 2026 sit? Well, to answer that, we've got to figure out where is the best and worst time to buy on the property clock. Now, investors often tell me that they reckon that 9 o'clock is the best time to buy, right before you go through this big upswing, this big boom in property prices. But if you only invest halfway through a property cycle, you're only getting half of that upswing benefit, which is why I reckon the best time is right at the bottom, roughly around 6 o'clock. And the worst time you could possibly buy a property would be around that 12 o'clock. It's a bit like what Warren Buffett says. He's one of the greatest and most successful investors of all time. And his simple rule is to be fearful when others are greedy and really greedy when others are fearful, which is why the property clock might completely flip your view of what the worst year or the best year actually means. You see, the mistake that most people make is thinking that the safest time to buy is at the height of the boom where everyone feels good and it feels like property prices will keep going up forever and ever and ever. But for long-term investors, the best opportunities are often found in the late winter or early spring during the slump, during that early recovery, because then you get to go through the whole cycle, which raises the big question. If that is how the property clock works, where are we sitting right now? Well, if I take you back to 2019, before the whole COVID-19 property boom, where would New Zealand sit on the property clock? Well, property prices were going up, especially in some of the regions, but Auckland property prices have been flat for about 3 years. Some places like Christchurch, they were flat for even longer. But as a whole country, we were probably around that 8 or 9 o'clock. Then COVID hit. Interest rates plummeted. It was so cheap to get a mortgage to buy a house, and the banks, they were handing out mortgages like they were candy on Halloween in Texas. By 2020, the property clock, it had ticked over to 10, maybe 11 o'clock. Things were going crazy. But then what happened in 2021? Things actually kicked up again even faster. Property prices were going up, but there were so many developers cranking out properties that the supply had started going up really fast and rental yields, they were really low. We started the year just before midnight on the property clock, but by the end of the year, we'd tipped over to around 1 o'clock. We were already on the decline. And then in 2022, all hell broke loose and property prices plummeted over 13% that year. Interest rates, they went up and developers were dropping their pants and dropping their prices. And that's where we started to see the economy turn. So where did we sit at that stage? We're around that 2 to 3 o'clock on the property clock. Then over the last 3 years, 2023, 24, 25, property prices have basically gone sideways for most of that time, and there have still been more sellers than buyers. So you guessed it, the country has been sitting around that 4 to 6 o'clock for around that 3-year period. Now, if we bring back that paper from the International Monetary Fund, on average, an upswing takes around 6.5 years. The downward phase takes, on average, around 4.5 years. Well, if we start the clock of that downward phase in November 2021, that was when house prices peaked in New Zealand. If the New Zealand property market perfectly followed that average pattern, we should start to see New Zealand moving into the next phase around that 6 o'clock mark, around the first half of 2026, which is why, even though from the news headlines it might feel like the wheels have fallen off and there's not a lot of confidence in the housing market, that might not actually signal the end of New Zealanders' love affair with property. What it could show us is that we're about to head into a new phase. So what are investors looking for while everyone else is focused on those bad headlines? Well, underneath all that negativity, a few important things are happening. First of all, house prices have quietly got more affordable, especially over the last 4 years. I mean, today, house prices versus incomes are 7% lower. They're 7% more affordable compared to incomes than in 2019 before we went through that COVID-19 house price boom. And that's because although house prices are up 24% since December 2019, incomes have actually increased faster. Secondly, although people often say that house prices are too expensive, how will anyone afford their first home? What we actually see is that first home buyers are now the biggest group in the market for the very first time. Never before in New Zealand's recorded history have first home buyers bought such a large share of properties. Now, it doesn't matter that houses were 65% cheaper in 2005, first home buyers are buying a bigger share of houses today. And the third thing is that interest rates have plummeted. And based on current forecasts, they're likely to remain relatively supportive through 2026. We might see some drifting up in mortgage interest rates, but they're not likely to spike back to the 7% that we saw a few years ago. So on my spectrum of worst year to buy property ever, it's as bad as it gets to ever buy property through to, it's a pretty good time to buy. I wouldn't place 2026 at either end. I'm not saying it's a terrible time to buy. I'm also not saying it's the perfect time to go out and buy. I'm not saying that house prices are going to boom tomorrow, because while they do tend to go up over the long term, no one can exactly say when they might start going up again. So the worst year to buy property isn't when property feels risky. The worst year is when it feels safe. Which is why I don't think it's fair to say that 2026 is the worst year to buy property, because the real risk isn't waiting until confidence comes back into the market, because once that happens and you start to see house prices rise, well, you've already missed out on some of that boom phase. And if you want help figuring out what all of this actually looks like for your situation, that's where you need to get a proper plan and see some real forecasts. And if you want someone to help you figure that out, where you are on the clock and what to buy next for your situation, that's exactly what our financial advisors do every day here at Opus Partners. You can click the link in the description to book a free session with one of my team at Opus, and we'll help you create a step-by-step plan tailored to your income and your goals in the property cycle. But if you're sitting there and thinking, okay, I think it might be time to make some property and money moves, you've got an important decision to make. Should you use a financial advisor, and what do you get, and is there any point in using one? And that's why you need to watch this next video, where I spell out the costs, the benefits, and exactly who should and should not use a financial advisor to invest in property. Click the video on your screen and I'll see you there.